Hey, Cut the Shit listeners. You can find every episode on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Go check us out. Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Bryan Link, COO here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. All right. Welcome back to another episode of Cut the Shit After Hours. I'm here today with the two esteemed co-founders of Plow again, Cameron Plato and Bryan Law. Welcome, fellas.
Thank you. Thanks for having
us.
I guess it's been a little bit since we last got together. I think we have traditionally tried to do this once every couple of months. And I think it's
about right.
Maybe on that schedule. I don't really remember. I
Feels
probably
that
have
way.
to ask our august producer, Emily, but she's going to ignore us.
She knows, but she's just pretending to not have the math
she doesn't want to talk to us, and I get it. I wouldn't want to talk to us either. But
we're happy to ask you to listen to us.
Focus.
Yes, she has to listen. That's enough. But every time we get together, I mean, there have been times where I feel like we've had really focused things we wanted to talk about, especially if you harken back to the very beginning, the whole reason for even starting a podcast and calling it Cut the Shit. That was a very specific thing about sales and the stuff in particular that bugged the shit out of you guys.
And they've not gone away. Those are still very real and active.
Yeah, they haven't changed.
Yeah.
I mean,
I still feel the same.
Yeah, we haven't
Fixed anything.
Arguably, even more recently, with mid-years happening and quarter ends, I'd argue those things are more pressing and relevant in our mind more than they typically are,
especially a couple weeks ago.
Oh, ridiculous!
And we're going to get into some of that.
Oh, good.
Because I do think because of the mid-year stuff, it's perfect for teeing up a few of those. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's an ongoing theme, right?
It is.
Sales shenanigans, and I wish I could say we're only in technology. I know it's not. It's across the board.
Everywhere. But
we have our own particular flavor of it in our world. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But today is not going to be one of those days that's specifically focused. We're going to bounce around a little bit. As Cameron already alluded to, we'll talk some kind of from a mid-year perspective about what do we do at mid-year? How do we think about it? And maybe that would be something that would be helpful for other people. I mean, doesn't mean they should do it the way we should do it, but they should think about their own sort of idea around, if you think about your business in 12-month increments, like most people do, because you don't have a choice from a certain perspective. Nothing else, you have to file a tax return. What do you do at the 6-month mark, right? Or do you do anything, and if so, what? So we can talk a little bit about that.
Party at the 6-month mark.
The 6-month party.
Yeah, the 6-month party.
And what I think downstream from that, it'll relate to that a little bit, would be to talk some about compensation, because we've just finished our mid-year review.
Yep.
Looking at some payouts around profit share. We talk about some of that stuff, and again, maybe that would be helpful to others.
Sure.
And then lastly, again, this is where we'll sort of transition to something totally different from an industry perspective. Talk a little bit about, I would say we'll talk about AI, but we don't need to talk about AI because everybody else is already doing that. It's dominating the news conversation. And in many ways, maybe what's interesting about it is that most of the news is kind of from what I'd call non-IT news sources, right? It's in the mainstream press or whatever. My mother-in-law, who's 73, asked me about it the other day. That's how you know something has really kind of gone all the way to the edge.
A 73-year-old ask you a question?
Exactly. Well, about technology, right? Because I think she thinks I'm pretty sure she doesn't know what we do here, but she asked me about that. So it's kind of everywhere.
We feed the robots.
That's right.
And the robots do the work.
That's right.
That's how it works.
So, I don't want to get into that other than a couple of different angles related to it that I think are specific to the world we live in, which is kind of the mid-sized business where the cloud is involved. It doesn't run the show. We're not. Our customers are not all development shops, building SaaS applications or whatever. And a lot of the view around AI tends to come from that perspective. These
it's
are
where it's at in its maturation cycle.
Real flesh and blood companies, providing products and services out in the real world, and they're not gigantic. These, our customers are not Fortune 500. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And there was an interesting article I saw about this idea of IT disappointing in the short term and overperforming in the long term, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea we could just riff on. And then, in that mix somewhere, we'll talk a little bit about Microsoft's new AI-assisted chatbot that they're rolling out, which is $30 a month, kind of an interesting idea. I don't know what it means yet, but again, worth talking about. So with that, let's jump in and start with mid-year. So in talking to some of the guys on our team about the mid-year, we've used a couple of analogies, and I've played sports for too long in my life, and so I feel like they probably get tired of hearing sports analogies. But we compared mid-year to halftime, right? And what do you do in a football or basketball game? Don't do it in baseball because there's no halftime. Mm-hmm. But in football and basketball, you had halftime. You go in, you might make some adjustments, right? Things are happening in the first half. You did some things well. You had some plans, to attack the other team or to make something happen, and it didn't work. So maybe you try to do something different in the second half. So I thought I'd just ask you guys a little bit about that concept and sort of how you think about it, both in our business and maybe in some examples from the past.
Well, certainly it's a good inflection point, and I think the halftime analogy is actually perfect in this situation. If you look at the score right now, we're ahead of where we hoped to be and where we thought we would be in terms of financial performance and that sort of thing at a top line measurement, right? When you actually dig deeper into it, you can see the stats that are, or the just stay with the same analogy, the players you thought were going to be, making the scores. By the way, that's an awesome cup. I don't know where you found that around here, but that's great. It's an old school Miller Lite plastic cup.
I feel like Bob Uecker.
It's awesome. That's the kind of
John Madden's going to crash through the window.
Yeah, seriously, that's awesome. But sorry. So when you start to dig into the numbers, though, the macro level performance, it's what's on the scoreboard. It doesn't really tell the whole tale. I think mid-year is a great time to look at that because you can hide behind the scoreboard and know that, hey, the guys I didn't think were going to score are getting worn out. The guys that I thought were going to score, they're not doing their job. Things just aren't where they ought to be. So, we find ourselves, interestingly, right now digging into the stats a little deeper. And as we dig into the stats, frankly, I think we figured out that the playbook that we put in place for this year, again, the score reflects that it's working, but it's really not working. It's not doing what we thought we were going to do. We didn't have the intended effects. So it's a good time to pivot and make change. And I think, arguably, if we had probably done the introspective search a month or two ago, we would have probably thought to make change then just the same.
Yep.
But it's a good kind of line in the sand, I think, to stop. It's month over month is too soon. Quarter over quarter is even tough to gauge. But, if you can, 6 months, I think is a fair assessment to go, okay, is this, can we move the needle a little bit if we make, draw back and reflect on things? And it's a good time for a pep talk, just like any other time.
And it's also far enough from the finish line to where if you do make some changes, it can matter.
Yeah. Yeah, there's nothing magical about a 6 month mark, but it seems to be, to your point, you can write it off in your head as well. It's not too aggressive in terms of making minor adjustments, and it's certainly long enough in the saddle that we can see a trend taking place. So
yeah, to your point, it's tough to chart something quarter over quarter. Yeah. There's not enough time to see the benefit or to even weigh.
You can write it off in your mind. Yeah. Be like, that was circumstantial.
And I do think for smaller organizations, those shorter periods of time are tougher too, because you're only going to have so many at bats, whether that's how many opportunities do you have, how many, calls did you make from a sales perspective, how many opportunities did you have to do work for a customer or a project. We just don't have. We're just not that big. If you have thousands and thousands of employees,
different story.
It's maybe a little different. But even then, you can still have short-termism in that, because something odd could have happened in that 90-day period to distort. That's not the same. Not going to be the same.
Well, that's right.
I think in that 90-day period too, you can make too early of a change as well. Like
100%.
You get in the first quarter, like unless something is just like very visible that you got to make a change on, you can change something way too fast in a quarter.
There's circumstances.
And not even know if it was going to work or not.
Yeah, everything's planting seeds, right? Some things grow faster than others, but the bottom line is nothing. There's almost nothing that's instant feedback in that sense. Certainly not in our world, right, where you've got longer lead times. It takes time to get services dialed in and running. It doesn't mean it's it shouldn't be a shit show on day one, but like it's not going to be perfect. It's going to take time, right?
Yeah. Well, and let's not kid ourselves. January 1st, there's nothing magical about that date. Most projects are still working. You're still, it's another. It's
Monday. An artificial. It's an artificial split, right? The calendar's all made up. So
commit to losing weight.
Commit to losing weight.
But you're right. So mid-year's funny around here. It falls. There is a somewhat of a lull in net new engagements and things because people take vacations. It's summertime. You're right in the thick of it. You start the mid-year with a holiday, so there's a strange sort of maybe 2 week lull in the middle of the summer. So it's a good time to where you can kind of turn your attention inward in many cases and kind of pay attention to the stats. I mean, listen, for us, for years, we knew what we needed to do to get the data that we needed in order to make decisions mid-year. But I think that's one of the critical things is having that data at hand. And, this is probably, you can't look back 6 months. If you decide you're going to get all your data together and, track all these metrics 6 months ago, that's not enough, longevity in the data to tell a story. So, this is probably the first mid-year in the existence of this organization that we've had historical data that matters to us, I think, across, what I'd call, vertical and horizontal views of the business where they kind of intersect. So I think this gives us a unique time in Plow's history in which we can actually do this effectively and rule out our gut feel. Now we can inject a little gut into it, but we actually have good solid data points that we can leverage and to provide some insights, which is nice.
Yeah, and it ties into this idea of thinking about. There's nobody that runs a business who doesn't want to connect performance to compensation, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we all, back to the sports analogy, right? You want to pay people that make plays, right?
Yeah.
That's what you want to do.
For sure.
Unlike sports, we don't have that kind of it's hard to evaluate everybody on that kind of using those sorts of very clear metrics.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you can't try, and you should, and we do, but it's not exactly the same. But I did want to hear you guys, having both come from the sales, sort of the sales side of the world, and being in either full or partial commission based, gigs prior to starting your own company. And what you realize when you start your own company is you're on full commission forever, right? That is the way it is.
That's a good way to look at it.
It's easy to forget that, but that is the truth. It doesn't mean that you can't have recurring revenue, but the bottom line is the check doesn't clear unless there's some money that came in to allow it to do so. So
you get what's left.
You get real clear on that in a hurry when you start your own company.
For sure you do.
But thinking about this idea of connecting everyone to the company's success without everybody being on commission, I just thought I'd like to hear you guys talk about that, and then we can talk a little bit about, sort of the early stages of what we're doing and how we think that's going. It's too early to tell in some regards, but I think we have some early returns.
I mean, I'll start on that. I mean, I was a non-commissioned contributor for years, where I was on the engineering side of things, and I realized that also took on responsibilities that were that of maybe a seller. And so when I realized the sales guys were making a bunch of money, they were getting paid for at bats and paid for hits too. I thought, well, I should just do that. And that's an easy compensation plan. I think there's usually two very obvious and clear levers, sort of a defense and an offense play, if you will. You've got a share of the profits or a share of proceeds or commissions, if you will, for a seller or individual contributor like that. That's easy math. That's not difficult in the context of this conversation. The other one is to take on more responsibility, and lead and operate and deliver and enable the institution to bring in funds. So that's a little bit more abstract in terms of drawing a direct line to how much you pay someone as an upside, but it's also plausible. The problem is when you get in the locker room. How do you pay the trainers? How do you pay the GM? How do you pay all these folks that are behind the scenes that make? I mean, let's be frank. If you don't think they're of value, then you probably shouldn't have them, right? I mean, they are a part of the game. That's how it gets played, and so those become very challenging. It's not like if you make $1, I'll give you 25 cents on the dollar, and there's your pay. It's very abstract, and extremely abstract within some ranks of the organization. So, we struggle with that. We think that we struggle with how to compensate all of those that aren't a direct line of sight to either the responsibility or the profits. But we've kind of created a culture here, if you will, that is a little bit more socialistic to a degree, one for all for one. And not everybody can pull a lever and see exactly how that steers the ship differently. But I think there's enough faith and confidence in everyone here that we know that they all matter. It all does come out in the wash.
Well, and to your point, it better matter, because if not, why are they here?
Correct.
Right.
So,
I mean, you have to ask yourself that question.
Yeah. You have to believe your answer too.
Right.
And
right.
So,
for sure.
When you do, we'll pay out a healthy sum of money this year in profit sharing, and this is the first year we've instituted that, where it's systematic and across everybody here. I think it's having the intended effect. If nothing else, it's causing people to pay attention to it. They're thinking about, listen, I don't expect everybody to think like they own a business. That's an unreasonable sort of expectation of folks. But I do think that if you get line of sight into it, and you have metrics that you can see, and you're living through, what impact you're having, again in somewhat of an abstract way, to the organization, then you know that it has an effect on your wallet. So it does get your attention,
right?
Everybody. So collectively, I want everybody here thinking: should we spend the money on that? Is that going to make a return on this? Should we hire somebody, or can we maybe chip in another half hour a day or whatever to really get this done? And that's going to affect our pocketbook. And so all of that has I think it's having the intended effect. I mean, we'll see. First quarter didn't pan out the way we wanted to, where people got that in their wallet. So this will be an exciting time, because we carry it forward, and they're getting 2 quarters at once. So it'll be a little bit more of a impact, but it's expensive. I'm not going to lie. I mean, and truth be told, back to what you just said, it's money that Bryan and I don't get to take out of the business. So
that's right.
I mean, we're paying for it at the end of the day, because it's just not left over to take. But we think it's a good investment. We think our people are critical to the success of the business, and getting them thinking along the same lines is sort of an ownership mentality. There's no better way to do that than to put money in their pocket, or not put money in their pocket.
You're dealt in one way or the other.
Yeah, correct.
Right? It's kind of the point.
I'd say it's hard to define expensive too, because
that's right.
It's hard. It's not like the sales example. It's hard to measure, and we've had this conversation around, if you pay Johnny a profit share,
it's found money.
Was the
right?
result any different than paying Johnny the salary, right? And I think that's the thing that's hard to measure.
Yeah.
You can measure it with culture to some degree, but that's still abstract as well. And it's just you want to get more out of, you want that to be an incentive for people to want to do more from my perspective. Mm-hmm. But you're also looking at going, did they?
Right.
Like, is their nature to come in and do exactly what they did anyway? So then it's reward versus earned income. To a degree.
I don't think, we've gotten very fortunate here in that we've grown pretty rapidly. We have a lot of new butts in seats and all this sort of thing. But I think that we all feel unanimously that everybody's a contributor. We don't have the general demeanor anywhere that I can think of within the organization of, I don't really feel like working much today, or I'm not going to chip in and make this happen or make a difference. If you've got pockets of those, I think arriving at a point where you're paying everybody a distribution of profits would be really hard to stomach. It'd be a hard pill to swallow.
Agreed.
And, to the contrary, if somebody lives here that's like that, I think the collective sort of Lord of the Flies will weed them out pretty damn quick, because it's frustrating, because the way our profit share is set up, as you well know, is it is a proportionate share of your weight within the organization in terms of your pay. So if you're, that if there's an extra butt in a seat, that's a proportionate share of what could have been yours that just went out the door as well.
That's right.
So you're not going to tolerate a lot of laziness or inability or unwillingness to contribute. So, lazily on Bryan and I's side, that's kind of nice. I mean, it somewhat of a self-policing system to a degree in terms of your peer, assuming people care what their peers think about them. I think they do, because they all work well together. Yeah. So, but I think if I were in an organization where if I knew I had pockets of, slack, or unwillingness to contribute, I think it would be very difficult to pull off what we're pulling off right now. I think it'd be hard, at least for me, to tolerate or to agree to do it. I mean,
No, I was just going to say that I think the rollout too is super important, right? I know that you spend a lot of time and energy in putting that together and making sure everybody understands.
You being Bryan Link.
We'll see. Because we're probably going to have to re-roll it out every quarter.
I think it's part of it.
In the sense of re-explaining how it works. Because,
Well, if we thought we were going to get it perfect the first time, we're kidding ourselves. Yeah. And that's nothing works that way.
And there need to be, at some point, there will need to be a light bulb will need to go on for most of the folks where they go, okay, I see. Yeah. Like based on those numbers, I remember from last time, and it sounds like we've grown without adding a lot of people, and that connects to
new measure.
I got a bigger check this time. Right. That piece was bigger. Oh, okay. So that's that stuff that Bryan was droning on about that I really didn't pay much attention to because I was thinking about the thing I got to do when I get back to the office. Or my girlfriend's mad at me or whatever it is that people can't. And I say people, that's all of us, right? You got to hear something 3, 4, 5 times before it starts to sink in. So I think we're going to have some of that.
There's no question.
but I think that's okay, too.
Yeah, but rolling out and revisiting, like that's that whole key around communication. I mean, there are going to be some people that are never going to get it. They're just going to know that if they put their head down and they work really hard, they get like a little extra check.
They make more money, right? And everybody they know who works a similar job just gets base pay. Yeah. And theirs just keeps going up every month, every quarter. I keep getting they're just getting me more money.
We're growing. I'm growing. Yeah, that's great.
Well, we had some interesting things that happened the first quarter, and really actually halfway through the year, even where the rubber hits the road and the checks clear, in that we made some intentional investments as an organization into some, duration of contract term type stuff or early hires. And, sometimes you don't just immediately start making money when you make those investments. And so, everybody in the organization is getting a little bit of the taste of, hey, it's all for one for all. That's win and that's lose. And so if we had to put some money into something and that was an investment, we all invested. Now, not everybody gets to, vote on that. That's not how it works. Right. But at the end of the day, it will affect their pockets, in terms of what we invest in.
And there's a longer term, there's a longer term perspective on that whether you're an employee who has a long term perspective or not, you do in this sense.
Yes,
right?
Correct. You don't
That's
have a
where
choice.
You might be thinking like an owner and not really want to. Like, I'd rather just take the money now. It's like, well, you don't get to make that's not a long-term perspective, and we have a long-term perspective here.
And I think all of this, especially when you start to tie somebody's wallet to it, it is good training or good perspectives to share, and that it look, I wish somebody would have walked me through this stuff when I was in my early 20s.
Sure.
I was privy to it. I saw it. I didn't comprehend it. I didn't feel the need to comprehend it. It just it wasn't relevant to me per se. But I think to be exposed to, like, we're not hiding numbers here.
And back to sort of cut the shit. That one of sort of the core values of cut the shit, right, is transparency. By definition, you can't cut the shit if you're hiding the hot dog somewhere,
correct.
Right? So, if nothing else, the guys that work here, the guys and gals that work here, I should say, I use guys generically, but they cannot say that they don't get told how the company is doing financially. Yeah. Now, they may not remember it. They may not have any perspective on it, but we are putting it up there.
That's right.
The only thing we don't show them is how much people make.
Right.
Right. Everything else is there.
They could get clever and probably get close, but
there's no we are not hiding that. It's not open book management, but it's pretty damn close.
Yeah.
Right. In that sense.
Which I think is great. It is, of all of the things, I think the biggest enemy in any business is inaction. And I think that inaction is oftentimes based in fear, and most of that fear is founded in bullshit. It is absolutely not anything that bites anybody in the ass.
You don't know.
Ever.
Right.
It's just I don't think we should do that. Right. Surely the guys, in the storeroom can't know what the profitability of the business is, and what's the harm in this?
Yeah, this isn't rocket science.
Yeah,
it's not.
I mean, if you're a public company, you're going to disclose it. So why not? I mean, everybody's investing their time and effort into this, just like they would money in an investment. So, it's hopefully we never have the podcast 2 or 3 years down the road. We're like, I don't know what the hell we were thinking. That was a horrible idea. But I mean, I feel like right now
Me
we're
too.
excited about
but
it.
I will say
it'll be his fault.
Yeah, it will be. Well, you'll be gone, and we'll blame it on
that's
that.
fine.
So
that's fine. I do think that, some of the stuff that we're getting ready to do from a reorganization standpoint, and I mean, look, we're a 35, 40 person company to say reorganization is
halftime adjustments.
It's an overstatement, but we're changing, we're making some fairly significant changes in the organization to the way, and it's really stems from the profit sharing plan in a lot of ways by saying, hey, look, we're not getting the gross profit that we think we should. We're making money, but we should be making more money. And why are we not?
Yeah.
And so part of that questioning came to, well, what did we do with making some concessions for longer term stuff? That was one aspect, but that's not really what changed the game. We don't think we have again, we're torturing the sports analogies, but why not? As far as halftime adjustments, we don't have players in the right position. Our formations are wrong, and some of our plays are wrong, right?
Yeah.
The way we had constructed it kind of coming into this year, and we thought those were right. Back to your point, it's been a long enough time. We're like, yeah,
it's not working.
It's not working. I mean, it's not like a disaster. It's not like we're losing money, but we can do better.
Well, to share just a little bit of insight into what's going on inside here to make that maybe make some more sense is we started this year with a plan where we had the independent disciplines within the organization take complete control over the ideation, process,
kind of like their own business.
Yeah, their own little businesses inside here.
Sort of standalone divisions was the idea.
Yeah, and so it was sort of like we said, hey, if you're going to play offense, and you're going to play every offensive position start to finish, and while that was great for perspectives on paper, that seemed to make a lot of sense. In the end, what we realized is you've got some people who have God-given skills to do certain, you got a great pitcher, but they may not be a great catcher, and they may not be a great outfielder. And so, to ask them to be the best at everything just didn't exploit their natural talents, which, you have to be careful with that word. But so by dissecting up and saying, you know what, it's all for one for all in this sense, delivery of the
going back to functions, let's organize around functions to do those functions well.
Correct.
The other issue we had that we didn't really take into account, I don't know that I realized I probably didn't think about it. I mean, now I feel like a moron for not thinking about it, but most of our customers use more than one of those practices, right?
Correct.
So we were creating confusion in certain ways with customers. Like
100% we were.
I mean, even our best customers are like, I'm not real sure who I'm supposed to contact. Sometimes I talk to this person and sometimes it's this person, and it kind of depends. And it's like, man, we're too small to have. We should not be having that problem, right? But the structural issue was some of that.
We took what was in the kitchen and it became prevalent out on the on the dinner table, and that it only took a couple of very keen customers to kind of mention that to us, and for us to kind of factor that into. I didn't really think about that.
But it all kind of, to me, it all kind of worked together within the concept of us really paying attention to what was going on profitability wise, because to your point, I mean, whether it's expensive or not, that's in many ways a value judgment.
It's a context,
but it's real money. Yeah. Like we're talking about six figures.
Oh, easily.
Easily, right? Yeah. So this is not, it's not. These are not $25 bonuses. Like this is real money. So therefore, we are paying attention to it too.
That's
just
correct.
like if you're a recipient of a piece of that, you should pay attention to it. But so I think it focuses attention in a way that maybe we might have gone longer, I guess is what I'm saying, with the current structure without it, sort of in lieu of it.
I have no doubt.
Yeah. So
it's I think we're trying some things here, and I think it just goes to show that sometimes you don't just step on the field and get a slam dunk. Sometimes your playbook's shit, and you got to go back and reinvent it.
Yeah, and I mean, we're again pretty good first half, but could be better. Right. I mean, that's really what, at the end of the day, all you can.
I've never sat back and go, it's perfect. We couldn't do any better. No. Like, that's never happened.
And I've been in a business where it was terrible. So, I know what that's like too. And that's not what this is at all.
Not fun.
And that really sucks.
Yeah.
Trust me. That's hard.
Digging out a hole sucks.
Yeah. Well, we talked on that a bit. Appreciate you guys sharing kind of where we, sort of thinking about this idea of the halftime adjustment in the mid-year. Let's transition again. I said we weren't going to go in a straight line, and we're not. So let's talk a little bit about kind of some industry stuff. Well, since it's mid-year, I never like to miss a chance to give you guys to raise a little hell about salespeople. So since it was into Q2, and I know we witnessed a little bit here and there. So, not that we have to tell stories, but just talk a little bit about, what we see out there on that front and how we just don't, we are not going to do that. We're not going to play that game.
I'll say this. I mean, I think there's a certain amount of economic uncertainty in the climate at the moment that's causing people to pay closer attention to Wall Street expectations. And, I mean, I'll keep it less direct. Like if you look for Apple to perform, they've got to sell how many of the VR goggles at $3,500 a pop instead of $400 like Zuckerberg? Yeah. Like, what the hell? Like we've all lost our minds. Like we put numbers out there. And actually, I don't think these organizations have as much put numbers out there as people have set numbers for them, and they've got to come up with ways to meet them.
Right.
My point in bringing that sort of craziness up is we're seeing more of the sales shenanigans exist as sort of a constant floor of stupidity. And
in many ways, that's a don't hate the player, hate the game kind of thing.
Yeah.
In many ways,
that's
it's not,
my point.
Yeah, it's not always, we want to throw stones at the individuals doing it, but they are couched in the system.
I don't think they woke up in the morning.
It's learned behavior.
Yeah.
There are some that I swear wake up in the morning and think about how can I be a bigger asshole today than I was yesterday. They're rare, but they exist.
There's one for sure.
Oh, for sure. I'll leave him nameless, but there's one that comes to mind right out of the gate. And
I think you could ask anybody in this.
Yeah, we're not good. This is why we don't. This is why we're not drinking any bourbon right now.
But the level of silliness is starting to rise again, like it was maybe in 2008, 9. In the craziness we're seeing salespeople and sales
playing let's make
do.
a deal because we need to book something.
Oh my God,
that sort of stuff.
And cutting their nose off to spite their face too, with no respect or regard for. I mean, we've got a client of ours and a friend of Bryan and I's that all three of us know him. He's a fundamentalist investor. Like he doesn't believe that a company like Tesla's worth money when they're losing money. Like how does that work long term? It's a foolish idea of valuation. We're starting to see that kind of behavior take place at the sales rep level, where it's like, at all costs, I'm going to do a deal, even if it means I book a nickel of revenue and lose $1,000 in the back end, and impregnate us with that penalty for 5 years. We're seeing that kind of craziness go on again, which as a buyer, I'm going to tell anybody listen to this, if you have a wallet in IT, take advantage of that. Like exploit the hell out of that. Like run them to the ground because they're willing to do crazy things right now.
Buy low.
Yeah, we've gone to customers that were thinking, I don't know if I can do this right now. I'm like, listen, if you can, they're doing crazy stuff I've never seen before. Try them. Right. Try it on. Get your timing right. Because you got to remember, if we're working hard to sell, the idea of brokering deals for both parties so they all win. So I'm not just trying to sell and get a nickel out of our customers. I'm trying to get a nickel out of the partners we have as well. That's fair for both.
Right.
But when they fire up the stupid flag, I'm going to take advantage of one of them. I promise you it's not the customer.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Wouldn't you agree we're seeing more of that law than we have? I hadn't seen it in a while. I hadn't seen it in probably 10 years.
There's a lot of pressure that comes with, the public.
100%.
And we've got to grow by X percent. That feels super unnatural to begin with. And they're at marks, they're at revenue marks right now where 40% is 40% significant anyway.
Yeah.
Like the dollars attached to 40%.
Oh, it's immense.
Unbelievably.
Some of these companies have revenues bigger than GDPs of entire nations.
Yeah.
Like, so
it's not. It's 40% on a big number is a big number, right?
Yeah.
It's not 40% on a small. You think about the Inc. 5000. Usually those hyper growth rates are small. They're starting on small bases, right? Because they're percentage.
Well,
so
you get
big. Hard to do that.
You've got metrics and markers that are trailing and leading that don't line up the way they normally will in times of economic certainty. So you're seeing, COVID threw a wrench in every financial analyst's toolbook, right? In terms of how the market behaves and, consumer spending's up, incomes are down, vice versa. This weird stuff's happening. And so I don't think anybody knows how the hell to deal with all this. So, obviously if you're in a sales organization or, sell more. That's the answer.
It's a tough spot.
Yeah. It's weird. It's a weird time, but I will say again, if you're a buyer, take advantage of it because it's crazy times are upon us. So
I do think that based on both your points, it is learned behavior to some degree. And if you're just somebody that is a competitor and a winner, and they say the rules of the game are this, right?
Right.
And your job, in order to keep it and to make the money that we've promised to pay you, is to sell this much stuff. Guess what?
I feel like rule number one is don't be stupid. Rule number two is don't be an asshole. And I feel like those have not made it in the rule book yet because we've seen some craziness lately.
No, but I mean, to Law's point, if you pay salespeople on revenue, don't be surprised when you don't have great margins.
Exactly what they're going to do. 100%.
It's sort of obvious.
Well, you bring up an interesting point. It's all around comp plans anyway.
Yeah,
that drives behavior. So
and when you write something down from a revenue perspective and you pay the rep the same.
Oh yeah, of course.
What's he or she care?
Right. Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I'm not hurting the company.
Yeah.
Right? You're approving it.
Right.
Yeah.
You've asked for
At least that's what you think.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The way you handle it's a whole different thing.
That's another thing altogether.
You start treating partners like shit and things like that, and it doesn't go so well.
No. So
you know who we're talking about.
All right, that's enough. It's enough negativity from you too. So
sorry.
We'll move
okay,
on.
I'm done bitching.
Obviously, talking about we want to talk a little bit about industry stuff. We're going to talk about AI, but not really because, like I said, there's already enough people talking about it. We don't need to talk about it more. I only want to talk about it in a couple of different kind of applied conceptions, really. And the first is this idea of, if you read the mass media or even business media, so the Wall Street Journal, national kinds of things, there's a lot of talk about it, and it's mostly focused around very large companies, right? Either the people creating it, you've got you've got Meta, you've got Microsoft, you got Google, right? These are all ginormous companies who are creating the technology, potentially open source that anybody can use, whatever. We'll see how that all shakes out. But there was an article in the journal recently about, is the cloud ready for AI? And it was basically talking about how, and this makes sense because if you think about the customers who use the cloud that we work with, the cloud was built to manage, kind of really move stuff from data centers and on-prem environments, those kinds of workloads, move them to the cloud where you didn't have to have fixed servers.
Flexible. You
had flexible. You could spin them up and down, right, to try to manage your costs. That was the idea. But it wasn't really to deal with some sort of unique technological application. It was mainly it was just a better mousetrap at the end of the day to try to match cost with usage. And almost all of our customers who use the cloud, that's how they use it, right?
And remove a barrier to entry. That was a big piece.
And that's the other one, right? Yeah. It's cheaper to get in to start, right? Our customers are mostly larger, so that's not as much of an issue. But in general, that's the business case. And I would say that's still 99% of what the attractiveness of the cloud is.
Yeah.
AI though is this sort of different, like you want to try to run a large language model and you want to try to apply this, particularly at scale. It's super resource intensive. It needs different kinds of chips. It got into all this sort of. Yeah. I read the article, and we'll link to it in the show notes if you want to go read it. But what it pointed out to me was, well, the question's probably wrong. Is the cloud ready for AI? And it's like, is part of it ready for AI for large company usage in terms of delivering AI? Not, if you were to read that, you might think, well, what does that mean for us with our cloud stuff? It doesn't mean anything for you. It has literally no application for you whatsoever because you're not running your own individual AI large language model, right? And it brought this bigger question to me, which is this focus on very large companies in AI. What about smaller companies? And when I say smaller, I don't mean small companies necessarily. Our customers are large. Some of them 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 employees. That's a big place.
And not Fortune 50.
But it's not Microsoft, right? I mean, these are the biggest companies in the world. Mm-hmm. I just maybe get your thoughts a little bit on that as far as your perspective, this idea of small to mid-sized companies and how do you think this relates to them, or does it? Maybe is a better question.
I think for sure it does. I mean, anytime you're doing, I'd say repetitive, predictable sort of, work that has consistent input and output, there's an opportunity to leverage AI. And much like what the cloud promised in terms of, low barrier to entry, predictable cost modeling, efficiency gains, all that sort of thing, I think AI promises to deliver a lot of those things. Now, there's that whole faction of folks that scares the hell out of them. And there's some things about that actually scares the hell out of me too. It's a little bit weird, not in the context of what we're talking about. I mean, on one end of the spectrum, you've got, kids cheating, writing, term papers. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got robots taking over the world. That's like the extent of the domain range we're talking about.
It's a range of issues.
Yeah, right. So it's people talk about AI. I'm like, what are you actually talking about here? It's just, But in our place, you think about things like where you're trying to process at speed. And I don't mean like speed, like, hey, I can turn out 4 more, proposals today because I got AI to help me. That's maybe a relevant use case. But I'm talking more about like seeing like log files come through and seeing nefarious activities or telltale signs, early indicators of exploitative behaviors and things like that. AI can see those things, analyze, put 2 and 2 together, come up with consistent gauge and judgment of those things, and obviously we just had a premise accident. I'm thinking about our insurance premiums.
Somebody just fell down the steps.
I'm not sure. Up the stairs. I watched it happen. I can see it from my vantage point.
For whatever reason, it happens here. People
don't fall down the stairs. They only fall up.
No, they don't. If it happens more than once, we have to do something about fixing it. It never happens.
It's never.
Those are unique injuries that took place.
Yeah.
Those are totally unique situations
for everything, I guess.
But for example, putting it in an actuarial. There's a great way to use it.
They fell up these stairs.
That's you couldn't see where he's pointing.
That's the landlord's job.
Yes, that's right. Sprinkle some salt out there. Yes, it is.
It's all ball bearings these days.
So, but back to what I was saying in terms. God damn you guys. Back to what I was saying with respect to what causes or how to use it. I think speed of processing, speed of putting two and two together and kind of summarizing, or those are places where I think the technology has a tremendous amount of promise. Now, are you going to go implement your own AI engine for that stuff? No. That's where the cloud presence of those engines are phenomenal.
Right.
And companies like Microsoft are actually doing some really unique things with respect to how they're saying, hey, if your stuff's in our environment and you expose your environment to our AI engine, it can go, for example, go through those log files and find some anomalous behaviors and those sorts of things and potentially identify threats at warp speed.
Yep.
That's cool stuff to me. I think that's really interesting and fascinating.
Interestingly, they've got a use case that they're rolling out, right, with an AI-enabled chatbot called Copilot inside Microsoft 365. And it's going to be $30 a month, which
have a hard time with that one.
On the one hand feels incredibly expensive, given that their most expensive subscription, the Microsoft 365, kind
the
of
common E3 is less than that.
is $35.
Yeah.
Maybe at $50, that's every security tool they've got. Yeah. This is it's still 60%, more than 60% of that for this, but when you read the stuff that it's talking about it being able to do, it starts to maybe make a case for itself. I mean, they're not fools, right? It's talking about things like its ability to summarize emails for you, to convert Word docs to PDFs, to analyze sales data in a spreadsheet for you. So they're taking the tools that are already inside the 365 environment and trying to point AI capabilities at them. And I'm sure over time, over time, they'll add more, and they'll probably give you the ability to do some training on yourself, for your own kind of make the chatbot do the things you want it to do. So maybe $30 isn't crazy, but if you think about that, you can see why swallowing that pill. You can see why at least why investors are excited about it. Their stock was up a lot, and that's short term, so it doesn't really matter. But the potential to, let's say that's a doubling of revenue inside what is the most successful subscription business in the world, right, is the Office suite, right? I mean, it is. It used to not be subscription, but they pretty much flipped everybody to it, no trouble, because they got 80-something% market share, whatever. I mean, Google's tried, but let's face it, Microsoft owns that. It's not even close. And if they could figure out a way to get 10, 20, 30% of their customers to spend another $30 a user on this thing, boom, wow,
Well, Microsoft doesn't.
Money,
sorry if you're listening to me, Microsoft. I don't feel like y'all do a good job of explaining yourselves, but if the idea is that I'm going to see $30 in increased productivity out of it, I'm having a hard time with the feature set right now making that math work.
Me too.
However, like most things they do, they put it out there, they screw it up. I'd say screw it up. They don't get much out of it at first. They take it back to the drawing board and they come out with something that's really knockout.
And let's face it. So I mean, this is brand new.
It's on the way.
I mean, it's brand new. As is. I mean, there's not like there's any other. It's not like there's other chatbot assistant, AI enabled chatbots that are just like doing the great business. Everybody's kind of figuring it out. So whether $30 is right or not, I don't know really matters. In fact, it might end up being something that becomes part of the. It just becomes part of the suite. Right. Or you can get get it out. You get the basics, and then if you want you want some sort of premium thing.
Well, I often don't think they think about it. They figure it out later.
Which
the power is tremendous, and you got to remember in that sort of broad scale computational analysis and processing is not something you do at the edge on the workstations and that sort of thing. But when you start to think that the majority of that data is being produced and stored within the cloud resource pool, you've got idle assets. I mean, you're talking about resource consumption in terms of electricity, but by and large, that stuff's, I don't think anybody's really rolling out huge, batches of computational processing power to, on the heels of the $30 a month subscription. This is spare capacity being used in a different way.
It'd be pretty much pure profit.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
that's what I'm saying.
I don't think there's any doubt about that.
But, when the more people's hands you get it into, the more that this, I don't think they're out there producing a raw or a finished good. AI by and large is considered to me, at least from my vantage point, a raw good. It has some potential. It's got some unique, some UI people built around that sort of stuff. But the power in it, we've got somebody here who's responsible for innovation and cloud services, and one of our staff members, and the ideas he's got on it are stuff that's absolutely crazy, like stuff that So the idea is he's now seen the processing or the potential of what's out there and available at frankly no cost, and is able to kind of tinker around with it and bring that to light.
And it's sort of an.
That's not.
I mean, in many ways,
possible
it's sort of an
in the
open
past.
source project in a
For
lot
the
of
most part,
ways.
yeah.
I mean, not exactly, but yes.
But you can prove your model.
It's a contributory model, right?
Correct.
Over time,
you can prove it.
It's
without
got training. It's
investment.
got a training aspect to
Yeah.
it. So
Agreed. So I think it's super, super interesting and super powerful stuff. What it's going to do, I have no idea. But it doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. AI does not have morality, and that's what scares me a little bit about it. Is anybody can tell it to do something, and so
right, yeah,
that's where it gets a little weird.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, right.
We'll see how that all shakes out. To close us out, I mean, you mentioned something about you used the reference like in the short term. Who knows? It's probably not going to do much, but in the long term, it's going to pay. It's going to do a lot. And I think that idea there was the last thing I read in terms of doing some research for this little session was this idea about that basically technology writ large tends to disappoint in the short term and overperform in the long term, right? And they weren't just talking about it. Really wasn't. This article, thankfully, wasn't about AI. It was just about technology in general, and that's just an interesting. I mean, it seems obvious to a certain degree, but I actually think it's counterintuitive because generally, if you think about technology with the pace of change and sort of the attractiveness of the new shiny object, right, and how much attention we pay to that, you have to sort of assume the reason people are doing that is because they think it's going to have an impact right away, and sometimes it does. I mean, this article doesn't say that sometimes that's not the case, but in general, new technology in the short term doesn't do much for you. It's usually costs too much. It doesn't have a great use case a lot of times. It's buggy. It doesn't work right. And so the article is really about how do you figure out how to invest in new technology and not get behind without chasing every shiny penny and not really getting anything out of it. So.
Well, it's that old sort of Venn diagram of the early it's the early adopters and the laggard adopters, and who's really overpaying.
Yeah, it's the Clayton Christensen stuff.
Correct. Yeah, so that has proven true time and again, and so I think that a lot of that's buried in that old school thinking or old school sort of wisdom. But I think you bring up an interesting point though, and I hadn't really thought about it until you brought it up. That is, most people's investment in technology, new technologies, is disappointing at first. It just doesn't produce the way you think.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, I mean, let's face it, everybody in kind of the developed world in the modern era is a tech lover, whether they admit it or not. Even if they say they're not, they are.
They're walking around with an iPhone or something.
Well, I mean, they're living in a world that worships at the feet of technology.
Correct.
For good reason. I'm not debating that there's good reasons for that, but we have a tendency to oversimplify because of that in terms of the thinking, right? That everything, like all good stuff comes from new stuff, first of all. Like, well, that's not true. Like, if you think about it, most new stuff doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the things this article points out is trying to make a variety of bets, almost like an internal, like your own venture capital firm internally, but what that assumes is that out of every 10 new technology bets you make, 8 of them are going to be shit. They're not going to work, right? They're going to be worth. They're going to cost you more than they're worth, so you're going to end up sunsetting them, right? But there's 1 or 2 that might really generate some real long-term value. And if you aggregate that over time across the spectrum of companies, it's big. So I don't know. It's kind of an interesting. It seems obvious, but then at the same time, it's not.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, I would argue probably 80% or maybe even greater of the revenue that we see is not to adopt net new technologies. They may be net new to the customer, but they're not, groundbreaking technology. They're not AI investments. Put it that way. Like it's just bigger, better, faster of the same stuff, or something that has some optimization in terms of management or cost structure, whatever it is. There are a few things, though, that started out kind of fringe that become so mainstream and have been, I'd say, sea changes in the industry. You look at virtualization and the widespread adoption of virtualization, which gave kind of birth to the cloud, that sort of thing. Those were massive, like overnight changes.
That's what I mean. Like it literally overwhelms every failed investment. I can't go through and tick down the list, but we know there's been 30 or 40 or 50 fairly well discussed ideas since virtualization just came on the onto the scene 25 years ago. You know, it was like early 2000s, I guess, is when it really kind of late 90s, early 2000s when it really sort of started. That have come and gone, right? That all had a shiny penny story, so to speak. But it doesn't matter because virtualization has created so much value that it was worth it, right?
It's just a super accelerating effect. You know, and to an extent, even the likes of, it's an amalgamation of existing technologies, but like the SD-WAN or the software-defined network and the orchestration of all that, that has actually produced real impact. And you know, I don't at the time it was a neat idea, but it wasn't something like I don't think anybody saw. I was like, oh god, it's going to change the world. But like,
no, I remember when it first kind of was going, and we talked about it early on when I was still CIO, and I was like, it seems like more trouble than it's worth, right? And I think that was probably the right call at the time.
Well, yeah, because these are always 3 to 5 year cycles.
They're still trying to figure it out. Like it wasn't really.
I'll give you an
quite
example.
Ready.
We have a client that decided 3 or so years ago to adopt an SD-WAN technology, and at the time, you know, there was maybe 100 players you could choose from, and you know that field for the viable players has really narrowed itself down through acquisitions and people just falling off the face of the earth and everything else. But you know, even the things we thought were in terms of weighted criteria have changed dramatically in the last 3 years. I mean, if you look at the analysis we had to process then to make a good decision, to help the customer make a good decision, way different landscape than it is today. I mean, now it's almost become a table stakes technology where it's like, yeah, well, you know, and all the flashy, you know, kind of shiny objects around the periphery and all the bells and whistles, most of that stuff didn't amount to anything for 90% of the users out there. You're like, who cares? You know,
and in the next cycle, that'll just be what everybody buys.
Correct.
Like, it won't
it's
even
edged out.
We'll stop talking about it. It'll just be network.
Part of
we won't have to say SD-WAN because that's the only kind of WAN you can buy.
Well, you think about the portfolio of services the telecom operators provided. I mean, God, that's narrowed down tremendously. I mean, you know, I won't go through a history of that, but there's really only a couple choices now, where there used to be maybe a dozen options of connectivity out there. So, and just the wide scale availability of all that stuff. You know, broadband is another great example.
Oh, for sure.
Like, the LTE devices, you know, those types of things have been sea change. But yeah, they sucked when they first came out. Like, they were horrible. So anyway, how did we get here? I'm sorry. I got on a soapbox.
We're talking about short term versus long
sorry.
term.
Yeah.
You were spot on though.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. I was sitting there starting
That's
to
what we do
guess
here.
it all. Yeah.
We give
pick each other.
We give undue praise.
Yes, thank you.
It's really
especially
good.
when it's Bryan and
So
Cameron.
yeah, thank you.
Usually
Yeah,
they're telling each other
Really
they
good.
suck. But
I was going to say punching each other or patting each other on the back. Those are the two options. Yeah,
that's right. On that note, we'll wrap it up for this episode. Boys, thanks again as always.
Thanks for having us.
Enjoy the rest of your July, and we'll be back together probably. It'll be football season by the time we talk next.
Let's go.
Which isn't
That's
bad.
correct. Isn't that wild?
All right.
Thanks, buddy.
Later.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on TikTok @CutTheShitPod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel @Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.